how to purchase industry standards, best practices. We'll do some presentations about ourselves in a moment, but just first a little bit about the company itself. So Mnemonic, some of you know us already, certainly. We are based in Montreal, Canada, but we have offices in California, in Shanghai. We have people such as Brian in Michigan and elsewhere. And then we have partners all around the world. So we really are a global company. We have about 800 customers that are subscribed to our platform in one form or another. And we tend to focus on mid-sized companies. I know a lot of the logos on the right-hand side here are larger companies that many of us are familiar with, but we do focus on mid-sized companies who want to get up and running quickly with a cost-effective solution that's easy to use. So we're not going to talk too much about our product today. If you're interested in learning more about what Mnemonic offers, of course, contact us, or during the exit survey, please fill out, there's an option to ask if you would like someone from Mnemonic to speak with you. Today's really about information and how you can optimize your standard spend, whether it's with us or with somebody else. We're here to be helpful. So just very briefly about myself, my name is Jonathan. I'm an engineer. I started this business about 16, 17 years ago. So it's gone quickly, and always been familiar with standards. But the company originally started with regulatory compliance, and we've now added the option to subscribe to standards. And we've learned a tremendous amount in the last year since we got into this market. And Brian, who's with me, he's been in the business much longer than I am. So I'll let him introduce himself.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. I live in Ann Arbor, so I'm already getting a few "Go Blue" comments. So that's hitting my heartstring. Anybody who knows me knows I'm a big Michigan fan. But been doing this over 20 years. Was really lucky to work with the guy Andrew Bank and Greg Hammerman, who got me into this when they started the business in Ann Arbor about 20 years ago. And I've been really fortunate to work with global giants in every industry, from my past history at a business called Tech Street, and recently when that business was acquired. Really passionate about, I think, driving insight, transparency, being defensible. And I think the quote you see at the bottom is really what I try to focus in on, and one of the reasons that Jonathan sought me out in the market, as we really take the standards business and really just the mnemonic business to the next level. So excited to be here, and I will have some more points and input as we go through the presentation. Appreciate it. And I do see some customers, a few prospects, a few friends, and even a few competitors. So we've got everybody here today, Jonathan. This is perfect. Thank you.
All right, great. So thanks, Brian, for doing this, and thanks, Brian, for joining Mnemonic a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago. He's been doing a great job, and he's really helped educate our team about what customers can do to optimize their standard spend and make sure their team has the right information at a cost-effective solution. So just really briefly, Mnemonic, we're going to focus on standards today, but Mnemonic is all about bringing together all of your requirements. So every business, every product is subject to standards, as well as regulations, rules, and other documents published by agencies and governments. And then, of course, you have your internal documents that are coming from engineering, design work, policies, procedures, customer requirements. So in general, companies always have lots of requirements coming from different places, and Mnemonic is all about bringing this together. Standards are special in their own way, just as regulations are, but the goal is to bring everything together. We're going to talk a little bit about standards today. So the main three elements we want to talk about today are: what is a standard? Most of the people on the call probably already familiar with that, but just a quick refresher. How do you purchase standards? And then what are some of the key factors you want to consider during that purchasing process? So a standard, many of the people on the call here will be very familiar, but it is basically a document that provides guidelines, specifications for a system, a product, a process. And there's over, I think, 1.5 million active standards in the world. So there's a ton of them. Typically a document, but more and more standards are becoming available in interactive formats. So very often these standards are legally binding, meaning you have to respect them. And that could be because you've contractually committed with a customer to respect a standard, or it could be that the standard itself is referenced in law, that a law or regulation references the standard, and therefore legally you need to respect it during in your operations or in your product development cycle. So you definitely want to pay attention to, the driver for these standards, and making sure that you're fully in compliance. But standard, basically a document with things you should do, recommendations, guidelines, requirements, depending on the standard. Very short history of standards here. Back in the ancient antiquity times, standards started to emerge to create measurement, and create some consistency in trade, whether it's volume of a certain product that was being sold or construction. Of course, they evolved tremendously over the years. And today, almost all products that we see in the modern world are subject to standards, with over 1.5, 1.6 million standards out there. There's about 93% of products are subject to standards. So nearly every product we touch on a day-to-day basis are subject to standards. And respecting these standards, of course, super important for safety and quality. So whenever people ask us, what do you do? Or they ask me, what do you do? And I think Brian can probably chime in on this. Like, it's always a bit amazing to explain to people, well, we help people find standards and regulations that they need to comply with. We help them manage those documents and stay in compliance. Vast majority of people are like, what are standards? Even though they regulate, 93% of products. So it's fascinating that standards are everywhere, and yet the average person barely knows that they exist. So I don't know, Brian, if you how you explain to folks what you do, and try and get them to understand in, an
I
elevator pitch.
I think you did a good job. I'm kind of laughing because I thought you were going to have my face next to ancient beginning since I've been doing this such a long time. So thank you for not doing that. No, I think you did a great job there. Thanks.
All right. So standards, how do they get created? Basically it's teams of experts that are brought together by standard development organizations, usually somewhat industry specific. And they work together to ensure that the products that are going to get out into the market, or tools or integrations, are working together through a standard. So they go through this process of identification, committee formation, studies. They try and come to a consensus. They open it up for review and for comments. And then once that is all integrated, they approve the standard and publish it. And this process can take years. I think typical standard development kind of takes at least 2 to 3 years. And people are talking about how to speed that up, but it's just very hard to do because there's such complexity, so much interaction with other standards. But standards are always being updated. There's continuous improvement happening. And the scope is quite wide. It goes from guides and manuals that are not necessarily binding, don't have requirements, to very technical, very detailed specifications that need to be followed. So these engineering documents are critical for keeping our products safe, high quality, facilitating integration between various products and tools and equipment. So why do standards cost money? We often get this, and we see this amongst, a certain portion where they're like, hey, why is the standard not free? If we need to respect it, if it's part of the industry, why do we have to pay for it? And the short answer is somebody needs to pay for it. It costs money to bring together these experts, to go through the process we just described, to get public comments, and then eventually to publish the standard. So all of that process takes time and resources. And right now, that time and resources are basically being given by the SDOs, by the publishers. And even though a lot of the experts will be volunteers, they're not paid for work on the standard, the SDO has overhead in terms of, quality control, operations, offices, etc. So that's why these standards typically cost money. Not all standards cost money. There are some free ones out there, but generally speaking, it's a way for SDOs to fund their operations, do these consultations with the experts, and get public reviews. And it ensures that the standards are going to be maintained, that they're going to be updated and eventually distributed globally. So this is basically why they cost money, just like books or other types of information we consume. So standards incorporated by reference into law. This is something that Mnemonic is particularly interested in because we have a regulatory background, but it's very common for standards to be referenced in law or incorporated by reference. And this is a way for government to leverage the expertise that is found in these standard development organizations. So instead of the government trying to build all these standards, which would probably be an impossible task, they instead will point to a standard from an SDO, whether it's the American Petroleum Institute or IEEE or another one. And this is very common. The US Federal Code of Regulations references over 25,000 standards. and the Canadian regulations reference over 6,500 standards. So this is very, very common. And in general, these standards, we talked earlier about why do standards cost money. In general, these standards are somewhat available for free. You typically have to log in to the publisher's website, and they have what's called a reading room where you can go and consult these standards free of charge. But there are often restrictions on them. You can't download them, can't print, copy, paste. So there are things like that. But technically, most of these standards referenced in regulations are freely available. And so in the US, there's a pretty good list of the ones that are referenced in law. In many other jurisdictions, there's no comprehensive list of what is referenced in law, but Mnemonic will soon publish one for Canadian regulations. All right, revision frequency of standards. So standards are typically reviewed every 3 to 5 years. Sometimes they're updated. Sometimes they're simply reaffirmed, which basically means the standard stays the same, and we're just reaffirming that this standard is still valid and still relevant. So our service and our friendly competitors as well typically offer free updates around the changes. And then, of course, you can decide whether or not you want to purchase a new copy of the standard. If you are subscribing to the standard, and we'll get into the details about subscription later, if you're subscribing to the standard, at least with Mnemonic, you get the current version and all the historical versions included in that subscription fee. So that is one of the large or significant benefits of subscribing versus simply buying the PDF. And then every time a new version comes out, you have to buy the new PDF. It's like a book, very much.
And Jonathan, I think that just from my perspective, that's something you get asked a lot about when people, especially in the small to medium sized organizations, when they're trying to justify the value, the
Yeah.
workflow, do they need to have a managed system? And they're thinking about how often the standards update. Admittedly, not every standards publisher is standardized, go figure. But for example, ASTM, high level of frequency. So you'll see a lot of medical device and others who are keen about ASTM specifically, not to pat them on the back, but because of their update frequency, having a managed platform at your fingertips becomes more of an interest and a value to the organization. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. There's with those 1.6 million standards out there, I mean, there's a lot of change happening all the time. So subscription has tremendous value with regards to keeping up to speed with what the current standards are. So just a bit of context here. National standards bodies, every country in the world has a national standards body or an equivalent. So here are some examples. These are basically organizations that are there to create standards, adopt standards, and then also regulate various bodies within their countries that can do certification audits and that can do other work. So these are some various countries: AFNOR in France, ANOR in Spain, but basically each country has its own certification or a national standards body. And then in some countries, they're not quite national standards bodies. ANSI in the United States is technically a private nonprofit organization that coordinates the US voluntary standards system. The majority of standard development organizations are US based. So ANSI works closely with them and controls to a certain extent that market. But ANSI, for example, doesn't create their own standards in contrast to some of the European NSBs. Canada has a similar system to the US, where it's a Canadian Crown Corporation that promotes the use of standards, but also doesn't create their own standards. And then Sen and Senelec in Europe is a European entity that creates some European standards and brings together the NSBs. So some nuance in the market just to, help everybody understand some of the acronyms that are out there, NSBs and others. So then SDOs, these are the actual organizations that create the standards. There's about 400 or so in the world, I believe. But some of the more well-known ones you'll be familiar with are ISO, which is a very international one based out in Switzerland. ASTM for testing. As Brian mentioned, they have a lot of standards that are being updated very frequently, and they're used not just in the United States, but really all around the world. IEC, CSA up in Canada, API for the oil and gas industry. So these organizations try to collaborate globally to ensure that there isn't duplicate standards. You don't necessarily want to have the same standard coming from two SDOs, and that the standards somewhat talk to each other or relate to each other. So a lot of coordination, a lot of collaboration that happens between these SDOs. So international standards that are adopted by national standards bodies. So when we talk about pricing, which we'll do in a moment, sometimes it's more cost effective to purchase a document that's been adopted by a national standards body rather than the original one. So for example, ISO will create a document, say ISO 14001 or ISO 9001, and then the national standards bodies in the various countries will adopt it and create a very similar version, but that's labeled as a British standard. And those can be more cost effective than purchasing the original ISO standard. But there's always a but. Whenever we say it's a lot more cost effective, there's always a but. The but is that there's delays to having these national standards bodies adopt an international standard. They don't necessarily adopt all the standards. So ISO, I believe, has thousands of standards that are active currently. But the national standards bodies don't necessarily adopt all of them, might only adopt a subset, a certain part of them. So there are trade-offs to be made when you're using adoptions of international standards. It's something to bear in mind when you're working towards putting in place a subscription for your organization.
And Jonathan, I just want to add to that you're going to get into pricing, but whoever you're working with, I can guarantee you if it's mnemonic, those questions will be asked. But we will be asking those type of questions because what we want to understand, does it matter to you, and why does it matter? Because 10 or 15 years ago, when I got in this industry, you'd have people who were dead set on I want ISO and I want ISO. That's it. Others would say I want BSI and I want BSI only. Well, there's different reasons. Maybe you don't want your big global company and you want ISO and you don't want to wait up to 6 months. Maybe you're an organization that's cash strapped or looking at how easy licensing can be with some of the other publishers. So you'll look at alternatives. I think it's really up to each organization through the buying process to understand that. And that's something that I would stress. I've seen it go both ways based on personalities at the organization or what type of financial pressures that organization is, but that's your decision. What I would impress upon the audience is to make sure that the people who are actually working to sell those solutions to you are taking you down that path, because it's a super important path to understand. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, for sure, Brian. And when you're going down this path, you're going to want to look at how this international standard was adopted. So there's kind of three buckets, if you will. There's an identical adoption, which means that basically word for word it's the same standard. Usually what's changed is the cover page, and maybe a couple other things, very minor changes. Then you have modified adoptions. This means that the standard was adopted, but there were some modifications made specific to that country because, again, it's being adopted by a national standards body for a specific country. And though those changes are noted in the document, if you're going through a certification audit and someone comes in and says, do you have a copy of the current ISO, you know, standard XYZ, and you say, well, no, but we have the version from Lithuania that's been modified because we wanted to save ourselves a bit of money. You got to question, whether the certification body is going to approve of that process. So again, that's where the discussion with someone like Brian is critical to understand what are your needs and therefore which version of the standard do you want? Do you want the original version or an adoption? And then not equivalent would be something where there's been very, very significant changes to the standard, and basically it's not considered an adoption anymore. It's considered a whole new standard. So you want to take this into consideration when you're trying to determine if you want the original or if you want an adoption. So we've talked about this already a little bit. There's the delays where the national standards bodies don't adopt everything. They don't do it necessarily very quickly. And though there are cost savings, there are trade-offs. So won't repeat that too much. Another element you might want to look at is jointly produced standards. So there are certain organizations that will work together to create a standard, and then that standard then becomes available from both organizations. And it may be more cost effective to purchase it from one organization rather than the other. And the idea that they collaborate is to leverage their expertise, avoid redundancy, speed up the process, and basically make standards more comprehensive and widely adopted. And again, so when you're talking to your sales representative, they should be guiding you to say, hey, that standard is also available from this standards body, and maybe it's more cost effective, or maybe they have subscription options that are more interesting. So there's all these little nuances and details that an experienced person like Brian will be able to walk you through. Okay, we've talked a little bit about what is a standard and some of these nuances around adoptions and jointly produced standards. We're now going to talk a little bit more about purchasing standards. What are your options? and then followed that with key factors to consider. So there's three primary resellers of standards in the market. There are others, so this is not an exhaustive list, but I'd say these are the three main ones. So there's Accurus. So Accurus is a fairly newly formed company, but it used to be a company called IHS, which has been around since the 1950s, started with microfiche, and then of course evolved into what it is today. And about 2 years ago, they acquired TechStreet, which was another standards reseller where Brian used to work, and it's owned by a large private equity group. So Acris is by far the largest provider of standards in the world. They have great products. They've been around forever, so it's a solid company, no question about it. Intertek Inform used to be called SAI Global and was purchased by Intertek, the large certification body. Again, they're supported by a very large organization and are delivering services around the world. And then us, Mnemonic, so we're an independent company. We're not owned by private equity. We're not owned by a larger entity. We are really owned by engineers and by people with scientific backgrounds who are passionate about delivering technical information, standards, regulations, and tools, workflow tools to our customers. So each organization has its advantages and disadvantages. And if you wanted to speak with us at Mnemonic, we're of course happy to have a conversation. There are many other options in the market, but typically they will focus on a smaller set of standards bodies. So, there's ASTM Compass, there's IEEE Explore, but often those platforms will have maybe 5 or 6 SDOs that they work with, whereas Accurus, Intertek, and Mnemonic have upwards of 50, 60, 70 SDOs that we're working with. So we bring together more information than some of the other options in the market.
If Jonathan, somebody had asked a question in chat, like for example, hinting at what you just talked about, MadCAD. So good
Oh, yeah.
organization, nothing bad to say about them at all. But in my 21 years of experience, that was not generally someone that I would go head to head with because it was content, depth of content, depth of the technology. So you'll generally see that the former IHS, now Acris, Intertech, that's that's the market. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
ecosystem. That's real. That's the players. It's always been a very small market, unless you're going to go buy direct from the publishers, and many of them don't have technology, or you're creating even a crazier workflow if you go direct every publisher. So
Yeah.
I'm aware of MagCAD. So definitely, we believe everybody's we can learn from and can be a competitor, but on a day to day, probably not as much as Intertech and Acris would be for us.
Yeah, there are companies like MadCAD. MadCAD, great company, but they tend to focus in a niche in the sense that they service a specific industry. So MadCAD is particularly great for architects and for people who are doing construction work. They're very focused on the building codes, ICC standards, and bringing together the information that architects and builders need to ensure that buildings are respecting standards and the building codes in the various states. So MadCAD is a very good tool. But and so if you're in that industry of construction or architecture, MadCAD could be a great option. But for a lot of companies that are, in a more general manufacturing industry, they will typically go to one of the three providers like Accurus or Intertek or what have you. Um, all right, great. So sorry, I'm just looking at the chat message to see if I missed anything.
Well,
So
you
these are
got a
some of the
good one.
pros.
Someone wants to talk to us opposed to boo us off. So keep it
All
up,
right.
Jonathan.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Okay, so another thing to think about when you're buying standards is DRM, or digital rights management. So in order to protect the value of the standard and ensure that it doesn't just go onto the internet for free, almost all the publishers require the resellers, such as Mnemonic, to implement some form of digital rights management. It basically makes it difficult, not impossible, but difficult to share this information. Just like when you buy music through the iTunes store, I know everybody streams now, but you used to buy a CD through the iTunes store, or if you buy a book on your Kindle, you can't export that and just share it. At least not legally. So the idea is that if you take this DRM off of the tool, it is breaking the licensing rights and intellectual property. So there's kind of two DRM models out there. The first and probably most common is a plugin. So this is a plugin called usually FileOpen. There are others, but FileOpen is the main one, where basically everybody who wants to view the standards or download them needs to install this plugin on their computer, and then they will have the ability to open up the documents, the PDFs. That works, but the challenge is you got to install this plugin on everybody's computer. It periodically will break. If you change computers, you need to like do relicensing, and Brian can probably speak to this more than I can because that's what they used at Tech Street back in the day. But that's for your first option. And the second option, which is the one that Mnemonic uses, is kind of like the Kindle. So if you have an Amazon Kindle or an equivalent e-reader, basically we provide you with the documents, but they live within our ecosystem. So we have a mobile application on iPad, Android. You have your computer, of course, and you can log in from any of these devices and view the standards that you subscribe to. You do have offline capability on the mobile devices and soon on the computers as well. So it creates a really seamless experience because you don't need to install a plugin on every last device and maintain all of that. But the one restriction is you're not technically downloading the PDF anymore. But again, if you have a Kindle, you'll be very familiar with this. You buy a book in the Kindle store, it synchronizes to all your devices. You can start reading the book on a Kindle device. You can switch over to your iPhone, tablet. So there's a lot of advantages there. And you can put up notes and comments and markup, and they flow through all your devices. So that's the mnemonic model. I don't know, Brian, if you want to talk anything about File
Just
Open and the plugins there.
Yeah, I'll just say in a past life, and it was the number one thing when you hit support page, it would say file open. So that gives you an idea of how it could be a little bit obtrusive. And for larger organizations, the users aren't allowed to install it, and even in small. So it can be funky. With that said, there was some value, but I think what it's really about is just, I think we are trying to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more nimble in terms of how we do it and create it more in an ecosystem. But yes, it was a number one topic. And when we would train people, if we had it here at Mnemonic, it'd be the first thing we talk about, because if you didn't install it, you can't view. And let me tell you how many people would go log in and go, I can't view the file. And you would hear a team talking to people about, you have to install file open. So it's definitely something that's been brought up. It's been in the space for a long, long time. I like what we're doing. And I know that we'll be leveraging some more usage data down the road to really give market what they're looking for in terms of not holding them down with the install and file open, but giving them the insight and the analytics that they need to continually stand up, sustain, and have a defensible standards program that they're buying today and into the future. So
Yeah.
definitely. Thanks.
Thanks. I'll just address one question that came up in the chat here. Someone was asking about upcodes. So upcodes is somewhat similar to MadCAD in the sense that it is designed for architects and builders. The main difference between MadCAD and upcodes, beyond sort of their software interfaces, which have some differences, is that upcodes doesn't have the legal right to the standards that they've incorporated into their software, and they're currently engaged in a variety of lawsuits with the publishers of the various standards. So, I'll leave that for what it is. I'm not saying their software is not great. It might very well be very good. I've seen a couple of demos. It does look good for builders, but they technically don't have, to my knowledge, the actual legal rights for the standards that are being incorporated into their software. And there's a bunch of lawsuits. You can Google that and find it. But the software looks pretty solid. Again, if you are in the construction industry or you're an architect or something like that. All right, so there's kind of two ways to buy standards. There's what we would call retail single standard purchase. So think of this as buying a book. Um, and this is, I would say, ideal for individuals who need a specific standard and don't need to share that standard with their colleagues. So again, you're buying a book for your personal consumption, you're reading it, and that's it. You can typically buy these standards in a PDF format, a paper format. So Mnemonic, we will actually print and ship you a paper format like in the good olden days. And it's still a pretty big part of the business, surprisingly. Even when we started getting into standards about a year ago, I was surprised by the volume of paper orders that we got and that I know that some of our competitors get as well. And then the third option you have around retail is bundles. So bundles is basically you get the PDF and the paper copy. So of course I love reading on paper whenever I can. I spend my entire day in front of my computer screen, so it's great to be on paper. And the advantage of the bundle is you basically get a discount if you buy both the PDF and the paper at the same time. The fourth option for retail. So let's say you don't want a full subscription. You don't want a subscription that's going to have a certain complexity and cost, but you do want to share the standard with a few different people. And maybe you're a smaller company, you don't have that many people, or you don't have the bandwidth to put in place a subscription right now. So what we offer is a multi-user standard. So this is basically you get the PDF and you can add up to 5 users to the PDF. And so they can access it and view it, but only up to 5 users. And it typically is a lot more cost effective than buying 5 individual copies of the standard. And this product, this version of like a mini subscription, if you will, was actually developed back at TechStreet, and I think some of the other companies offer it. Now, it's not available for every publisher. Some publishers agree to do this, some don't. But when it's available, Mnemonic can offer this at a interesting price, I think. Um, all right, subscriptions. So subscriptions, there are a few little angles here, and we'll go through them. So when you subscribe to content from the standards bodies, there's a few ways you can do it. So first is what we call a custom collection. A custom collection is basically you specify which standards you want, and then a tailored package is created, and a price is provided based on a couple of factors, which we'll discuss in a moment. The way the pricing is affected is generally speaking the same for all of these options. So you have custom collections where it's like you pick what you want, it goes into your collection, and then a price is generated. A normal collection is a collection that's been defined by the publisher. So the publisher says, we have a collection for testing of microscopes, or maybe Brian can give me a better example, but a collection that's been defined by the publisher, and you say, I want that collection, and that's
API
it,
refining, for example,
right?
or ASME boiler and pressure vessel code. Yep, yep.
Yeah. So those are defined by the publisher. Um, and those are typically offered at a lower price than if you were to buy all the individual documents within the collection. So it is more cost effective as long as you're going to use the majority of the documents in the collection, right? If you're only using a small subset, you're going to be better off with a custom collection. So there's a balancing act there that needs to be done during the procurement process. The two other ways you can purchase standards from a publisher, and this is not necessarily available from everybody, but block pricing. So block pricing is where you say for API, I want to buy 20 documents. I don't know exactly which 20 I want right now. Maybe I only know 10 documents that I absolutely need from API. But you buy a block of 20, and then the advantage there is throughout the year, because these subscriptions are typically annual, throughout the year, you can add 10 more documents from API to your block without needing to go through the approval process, without needing to get a price, because you've already paid for that block of 20 documents. And so this can be advantageous from a cost point of view, but it's certainly advantageous from a flexibility point of view, because very often you don't know what projects your company is going to work on in a given year. New clients come on board, new products spin up, and this gives you the flexibility to add more standards during a subscription period without incurring complexity or cost. Now, it's not available for all publishers, but certainly when it is available, it's one of the things we will recommend to people we work with.
And I think a big thing would be, and that is from a past life, but it's something that obviously it's not going to be unique to the past life that I'm from. We're all going to be looking at that, but I think the key for this is, regardless of the pricing, and there's some advantages. It's really about, in my opinion, how you delight your end user community. So engineer, regulatory, quality, I don't care what their title and persona is, they're looking for a standard, and it falls into a publisher where you have the flexibility to add those documents. Imagine the user, instead of saying, hey, Bob or Cheryl, we don't have it, go talk to your admin, this intelligence to say, hey, Bob or Cheryl, your company actually has a slot open, and then there's basically a way to communicate where your leadership or your admin, if you will, if they approve it, the file's added instantly. That is really delighting end users. So there's value not just in the commercial side, but I think about how nimble it is, and people, at least in a past life, would go, you mean the file's ready in 8 minutes? Well, yeah. And so I think that there's workflow and delighting users is an aspect too, that there's some value on that side. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, for sure. Speed of delivery of the standards to the end user is one of the big factors where the engineers like, I need this standard. Oh, they have it 20 minutes later. they love that, versus having to wait days and days. That delays your project, which has a lot of cost, right? So you want to avoid any delay that's unnecessary, and blocks allow you to do that. So the fourth option for purchasing packages or blocks or collections is what's called packages. And so some companies do this more than others. Accurus or IHS certainly did a lot of this. This is basically where the reseller creates a package that can include publications or standards from multiple different SDOs, different publishers. So you might have an oil and gas package from Accurus or another company where you're going to have documents from API, you're going to have documents from NBBI, and they create a package that you then purchase. And that can sometimes be advantageous if you're going to use most of the documents in those packages. But you definitely need to really check that you're going to use what's in that package and that it's better than your other options of, say, a custom collection or the publisher's collections or block pricing, because sometimes things will get put into that package that you're not going to use. And so you gotta be careful, but sometimes it's advantageous, and you definitely want to check what's in the package. And this will sometimes work better for larger organizations who have a very wide need. The smaller companies, again, you might be buying something, buying more than what you actually need. So you got to check that. But that is an option in the marketplace.
And then Jonathan, just something to say is, who you're working with. I know we have it here. In a past life, we had a group, and one person in particular who's always going to be super special to me, who actually might be on this call today, where ingesting the data, when we look at that data, we have a team that then goes, have you passed tipping points? Because many of you do not know those tipping points, which has been a gray area, and that's part of our job to be transparent. But we will look and find out, hey, if you've sent 650 documents from Play Along API, you've passed a tipping point. You would get the full set. And there's back and forth that goes there. So I think having some insight in our side or the organization you're working with to make sure they guide you, have you passed that tipping point? Or you're so close that Murphy's Law says if you don't buy this set in a week, people are going to ask for stuff. And now you've created some inefficiencies because you didn't get the full set. So I think having a vendor or partner is the word I like. Vendor is a dirty word to me, and everybody can be a vendor. If you're your partner, we have people and talent that does that data insight for you. And then between that up front and then usage reports, I think you're doing the things that you need to do just to make sure you're building something that's sustainable and defensible. Sustainable, defensible. You do those two things, success happens. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yep, for sure. Um, So there is a question in the chat here, which we'll address on this slide, which is how prices are determined. And I'd say the prices for the subscription packages, again, whether you're buying a block, whether you're doing a custom collection, whether you're doing a package from the vendor, or whether you're doing a publisher collection. So again, there's those four options, custom collection, a publisher's collection, the block where it's a number of documents you're buying, and then the package being prepared by the reseller. So regardless of the type of product you're buying, the price will then vary based on primarily two things. This is not 100% true for all publishers, but it's broadly true. Simultaneous users, so how many people can look at a document from the same publisher at the same time. So literally at the same time, Brian's logged into the system, he's looking at a document, I'm logged in, and we're looking at a document from the same publisher. That would be simultaneous users. And the second is locations. And these locations, always a bit of a gray area, but generally speaking, they should be the physical offices or manufacturing locations or research laboratories that you have and that need access to the standards. And you can make this flexible. So for a certain publisher, you might say we only need 2 simultaneous users and 2 locations. But for another publisher, you might see we need this for all of our locations and we need more simultaneous users because more people need the standards. So it can be adjusted on a publisher by publisher basis. But once those restrictions are in place, that A is going to drive the price, and B is going to drive who can access the standards at your organization. So those are the two main factors. Some other publishers will ask for the size of the company, just in terms of headcount, or the number of total users that are going to have access to the standards. So that does exist for certain publishers, but in general, it's simultaneous users and locations.
And Jonathan, just a point to add, that's probably one of the biggest pitfalls that because we're all proud of our families, our companies, or at least I'd hope you would be, or you probably wouldn't want to work at that company or be with your family, but I think you get the point. We're proud. So what will happen in this space in my 21 years of experience is somebody will say, "Hey, I'm with Kelly Enterprises and I've got 54 locations." You really have to challenge them through changing narrative, through discovery to understand, okay, but only 12 sites do electrical engineering. So why would you want this at 52? And I think the more you challenge and do that again, back to sustainable, defensible, sustainable, defensible. You're going to hear me say that if you ever work with me over and over and over. So that's just something I wanted to add. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, for sure. And that kind of hits on a point here from one of the people in the webinar that have answered a question. It's hard for large companies to give, they say it's hard for large companies to give accurate locations as many employees are now working remotely while their office location may be in another state. And I think for sure remote work has dramatically increased and it's not going anywhere. So the general rule that we use and the publishers use is basically, even if the person is working remotely, it's which location are they tied to that they're technically working out of, even if they're working remotely. And then that location will dictate which standards they get access to. So the remote workers, that's kind of how it's been interpreted. And some SDOs, some publishers are looking at alternative ways of pricing their standards, but it's a very slow changing industry. So it's still primarily location based, but the remote worker invariably is tied to some location that they're being, their payroll and their cost of the employee. So you want to use those locations as your things. Then the remote workers can have access through the platform. So here, some like I said, some publishers will ask for the total number of users that need access to a standard, not just the simultaneous ones. So generally, when we're going to do pricing, we're going to be looking at, here you have the SDOs, just some sample ones: API, BSI, NEMA, ASTM. How many publications does this company want to subscribe to from these SDOs? How many product sets? So if they're buying a collection rather than individual documents, and then how many simultaneous users and how many locations. And once we've created this matrix, then we can do the pricing. So it is kind of complicated, honestly. Like we have a team of people doing pricing with spreadsheets and all sorts of things. It's a bit of a, secret sauce. But then for some certain publishers, we'll have to approve the quotes that go out to the customers. And they certainly have a record, a history of what people have subscribed to in the past for a given company. So there's a bit of checking and balancing to make sure that, kind of the truth is being used as we do these quotes, not just us, but any reseller. Okay, that was a little bit about purchasing standards. Again, feel free to put in questions if you have any. We'll talk about a bit more. We've already kind of alluded to various factors you want to consider, but we'll just go into a bit more detail there as we wrap up.
Hey, Jonathan, just give
Yep.
you a good time check. We got 13 minutes. So just want to make sure we're conscious of a Q&A and just make sure we're good. Just give you a heads up. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, Brian, for sure. So we've already talked about making sure that you have your locations nailed down and you don't want to over purchase because it just drives your costs up for no fees. Tailored contents, you want to work with your partner, whether it's Mnemonic or Accurus or Intertech, to really figure out what do you really need, who really needs it, and then are you better off with blocks or custom collections or packages, and really try and find the right fit. And then annual license renewals in general, the subscriptions are 1-year contracts, but some companies want to engage for multiple years to ensure that they have pricing for their standards in advance and they're not surprised. But it should be noted that SDOs, the publishers, generally increase the price of the standards about 1 to 3% a year. So you got to be aware of that. But multi-year agreements are possible. Then occasionally some publisher will dramatically change their prices because they haven't changed them in 10 years. And so they'll say, we got to catch up for 10 years. Now the customers don't particularly like that. So the SDOs, we encourage them not to do that, but occasionally they do that.
And Jonathan, just a point real quick. So got 21 years been doing this. So you're right. It's roughly 1 to 3. Some would be 4. Once in a while, you get a publisher who's, hadn't updated pricing in a decade. So they try to do a big jump. But ultimately, there's generally not major change. So if there is major change at mnemonic, it would be because I'll speak about mnemonic because this is where I work now. It would be because the publisher has had a big change and they're saying, hey, it's going to go up 12% or whatever it may be. Outside of that, I think we fundamentally believe that yes, we value our work, we value our platform. Cost will go up slightly, but it shouldn't be beyond that. If it's 1 to 3% from the publishers, you'd imagine a couple points, but it shouldn't be 12, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. Sustainable, defensible, sustainable, defensible. It has to be that. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, for sure. And we're constantly investing into the platform based primarily on customer feedback and also based on what we know, the market wants. So I have some small price increases, but we want it to be sustainable and defensible and make sure it drives value for the end user. At the end of the day, it's all about value. There's a question here about if someone opens a document and then walks away, does that influence the simultaneous users? It does. They do get logged out automatically after I think 15 minutes of inactivity, something along those lines. So you do have that, and so that way your simultaneous users are not locked because somebody left a document open on their computer 1 month ago, and now it's locked for everybody. Um, so just balancing customization costs. We've already talked about this a fair bit, but basically you want to balance buying collections or packages with custom content to avoid overpaying. And there's that tipping point. There's a gray area, and so that's where it's important to have a discussion. It's not simply, hey, I want these documents, give me a price, let's go. There's nuance in there that you'll want to talk to a human about, an experienced human about. And then critical features. So when you're evaluating platforms for your organization, you'll want to check, how fast are the updates coming through? Is there a red line? So we haven't talked much about red line, but that's basically the ability to compare the current version of the standard with a previous version and see all the differences. So is red line included in the cost, or is there an additional cost? Alerts around changes, access to historical versions. Again, is that included in your subscription, or is that a supplementary cost? And then usage reporting. So this is reports that allow you to see who viewed the standard, who downloaded it, how many times was it viewed, at which locations. And that data is super critical because when you go for your renewal the following year, you might discover that a bunch of standards that you had subscribed to were never used, right? So you would not want to necessarily resubscribe to them the following year. And then some standards, maybe there was a lot of people trying to access them, but you had limitations on simultaneous users. And so that was creating some frustration with the user. And there, maybe you want to increase the number of simultaneous users. So that usage reporting is super important, and you want to make sure it's easily accessible for your administrators and that it's included free of charge.
And a commentary would be it's also really important that those user reports are by the professional that's serving you uses those. So there's a lot of insight to understand, is it a training issue? Is it, hey, we might have bought too much content? Getting that insight to really make sure you pivot for the organization is helpful. So, for example, in my history, you see that someone's not deployed it at 22 locations. You're not calling someone to say, hey, renewal as is, let's go move forward. You're looking at the data to draw insights, understand how do we close that gap? How do we drive more value? So I just want to be clear. It's not just the customer using it, whether it's cost or insight. I would hope that the professional is using it to help you navigate, because I will say it again, it's got to be sustainable and defensible. And I would much rather have a client for 15 years than someone that I'm worried about. I got to get 5%. I got to get 5%. I got to get 5% more. If that's the case, because you're adding and growing, great. But if it's not and data shows this is where you need to be, that's okay. That's how you build long-term sustainable customers. I know it because I did it. Thanks, Jonathan.
For sure. And we have a couple of questions, which I'll get to in a moment. I do see the questions. We have a slide about them. We only have about 10 minutes left, so I'll go through the rest of this fairly quickly. But you definitely want to also evaluate user support, platform integration. So, the onboarding and training program that the vendor is going to provide to you, webinars, tutorials, so a support portal, integration capabilities. So does the vendor have a single sign-on, which allows people to access the platform by simply logging on to their work systems? And then is there an API that's available so you can pull data out, not the standard itself, because that's protected from an intellectual property point of view, but say usage and other metadata around the standard and load that into other systems like a Power BI or other things. And then administrative features that allow you to easily manage your account. So adding users, pulling data, user statistics, running reports, things of that nature. So I think these are pretty typical recommendations for any software platform you're going to be purchasing, but it's certainly true for standards as well. Other uh, other considerations you might want to take is just looking at the need for historical versions, ensuring that other types of information can be included, such as regulatory data, military specifications, or other industry-specific things that are not necessarily just standards. Redline, make sure it's tailored to fit your need and focus on key benefits. So it's all about flexibility and cost efficiency. And so this will address kind of the two questions that are in the chat here. This kind of theoretically, at least, I emphasize theoretically, there's sort of you have two options. So one is you can try and get all your standards in a single solution. This has advantages, like it simplifies procurement. You only have one vendor to work with or one partner. It's one interface for your users to manage, less administrative tasks. The challenge with this is that typically that is only possible with if you have a small number of SDOs. So if you only need data from like 2 or 3 publishers, single solution is very feasible. But if you need data from a dozen or 15 or 20 different publishers, this can be quite challenging because basically you'll only have one option in the marketplace. And so that's where you got to think, is a single solution really feasible for your organization?
Jonathan, just to add, in the 20 years, is that you'd be shocked. I won't name them, but if you look at engineering, construction, oil and gas, pharma, you name it, the biggest and baddest, almost most of them all split the solution. Why did they do that? Well, I know why. They like some of the technology in the past life, and I think they like what we're in our technology here. But it was really about controlling narrative. These companies are proud. They want to have part of the narrative, and I think that being able to control the narrative is something that's been really important. And you're seeing even more and more and more of that lately with some of the changes in the market, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. Wherever you feel it's changed, and I know that as companies are saying, no, we're not going to be dictated to. We're not. We want to be a part of the narrative, and so that's always been in place. I think the more progressive organization will say, yeah, we're going to look at diversifying because they want to be a part of creating what this market's going to look like, because it's only going to change in another couple of years when some other things change in this market. And I think you know what I'm hinting at, right? So a lot's going to change. The one thing that I would just stress that's is super important here is journey. Definitely a journey here. So a lot of the people, whether you're on this call, are new clients or prospects, we will be building out and deploying based on what we hear and learn in the journey. And I think for a lot of people, that's really refreshing, because I think the market's feeling a lot of dictating, and people again want defensible, sustainable. And that's what we're here to do.
Yeah, and so splitting your subscription across 1 or 2 or 3 providers has a bit more administrative work for sure, but you have a bunch of advantages. So one, you don't have all your eggs in one basket, right? You can shop around for the best price and the best service. You have flexibility, so you can see different tools, and sometimes you'll discover tools that have some technical advantages that are interesting for your customers. Risk diversification, again, not all your eggs in one basket. And today, I think 15 years ago was maybe a different story, but today was single sign-on. If you have single sign-on on 1 or 2 or 3 platforms, users can very easily jump from one to the other. So at Mnemonic, we can insert a link to standards that you've purchased on another platform. So you can insert that into a link. So when it says, you've bought this API standard on this other platform, click here to go see it. You click on it, it sends you over to the other platform, and then you go look at your API standard over there. And because with single sign-on, you're already logged in to both platforms, it's a very seamless experience for the end user. And again, you get these advantages of not all your eggs in one basket and flexibility. So we simply put a hyperlink to the other systems you have. And as long as you have a valid subscription over there and they have single sign-on, you're popped over and no issue. And as Brian said, in a large company, you almost invariably have multiple solutions, different needs, different teams. You don't want all your eggs in one basket. And this experience has become a lot easier with things like single sign-on. So a few last points here to wrap up. You want to make sure that when you're going to purchase a standard subscription, you focus on the relevant standards that you need. And if you need help identifying that, Mnemonic can help, and we have partners in various industries that can help. Make sure leadership understands that this is an investment, that having the right information and the right tools at the fingertips of your engineers, of your scientists, of your product development people is going to save time. Um, Conduct a gap analysis. So figure out what you're doing now, how many people are buying retail maybe, and you don't even know about it and costing the company money. And then other ways you can improve the management of standards based on how you're doing it today. Develop an implementation process so you can work with our team or any vendor to make sure that there's a clear roadmap of how we're going to deploy this, who's going to get the training, who's going to be the admin, and ensure there's a clear understanding of who's responsible for what. Training, we've talked about that. Make sure you have a good training program in place, and we'll work with you on that one. Verification, so you want to make sure that you're constantly ensuring your organization is up to speed on the latest standard, that people are getting their notifications. And at least in the mnemonic platform, you have the ability to see, hey, did we acknowledge that a new version has come up? Who's responsible for it? What are the actions they're taking? So some workflow tools, which we won't talk too much about today, but allows you to create traceability that you're on top of the latest versions of the standards. Use those metrics and usage statistics for optimizing your spend. Always collect feedback from your customers, from your colleagues about the platform you've selected or the platforms, and work with your vendor to improve it. And then, when it's relevant, make sure you get your certification
Hey,
around
Jonathan, I know
compliance.
we had a question somebody had asked about how do you handle, custom collections and
Mhm.
add-ons. So anytime you add on content, locations, almost every time there's always a random exception, but we will prorate the fee. That's a very nimble process, and it's generally pretty nimble across the industry. I think everyone gets that, being nimble and fast on that. So I'm not going to tout that we do something super special. What I would tell you is that we are super keen about when you need something, getting you the pricing, getting you the files added. But to answer the question, prorated based on your expiration date. People are asking about our contact information. So my information, if you want to talk to me or the engineering expert, Jonathan, but my email is bkelley, Kelley, at mnemonic.com. And I'll put that into the chat right now just so people see bkelley at mnemonic.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn. And we are happy to make sure we empower you and we engage with you and we're transparent. If we do that, we believe our clients and this market will do what, John? Have something that's sustainable and
So I'm gonna have to get you a T-shirt with that on it.
sustainable and defensible. That's right.
Sustainable, defensible. But
All right.
so just wrapping up real quick, a standard, it's a document with guidance and requirements. I think we all know that. You can purchase it in retail format, so one at a time, or a subscription. Get a provider that's solid, and then really focus on that customization. Get the solution that's right sized for you, and figure out how your organization is going to use it. Build a workflow, and effective implementation really does drive operational excellence, reduces errors, reduces quality problems, and speeds everything up. So it's an investment in your company. Um, so I think that's it. We're right on the money here on a 1 hour mark. If you have any follow-up questions, I'm happy to stick around for a bit. But I understand people will have to run. Any questions, email us. Please do complete that exit survey that we have at the end of the webinar. Any feedback is good feedback. So we really appreciate those of you who joined us today. And a recording will be made available, as well as the PDFs of this presentation and the document that goes with it. So thanks so much.